Good afternoon, and welcome to Keys to Achieving Technology Fiscal Fitness that Yields Better Business Outcomes, a Health System CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Apptio. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health System CIO, and I will be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments as they occur to you in the Q&A box. Nice way to view the screen. Click in the top center, get it in side-by-side mode. Then you can adjust the divider to get the slides and the video boxes the size you want them. And it should say speaker view in the top right-hand corner. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go about 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring John Henderson, VP and CIO with CHOC Children's, Chif Umejei, VP of IT at New York-Presbyterian, and Chris Van Wesep, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Apptio. And then we're going to have we'll take your questions. So let's jump right in. We got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, educate our audience here. John, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Sure, thanks. I'm John Henderson, Vice President for CHOC Children's in Orange County, Southern California. We are a pediatric health system, 2-hospital system with 30 plus specialty clinics and another 30 primary care clinics around the Southern California region. We have over 700 physicians and are affiliated with UC Irvine, and we have over 5,000 associates that we support. And we are see around 350,000 outpatient visits every year and another 90,000 folks come through the ED. And we are a full service pediatric health system.
Very good. Thank you, John. Chif?
Sure. I'm at New York-Presbyterian. We're affiliated with Weill Cornell Medicine and Columbia Doctors, Columbia University. We're 11 hospital health system, predominantly scattered around the New York metropolitan area. For the most part, 2 massive academic medical centers are flagged by us, our Weill Cornell campus and our Columbia campuses. We do have a pediatric hospital, the Children's Hospital of New York, and the other hospitals that are within the New York City boroughs.
Chif, how would you describe, do you have sort of areas that you're supposed to focus on in your role as opposed to a general focus? Are you specializing in any particular projects or areas?
Yeah, sure. My role predominantly is clinical systems. So our EHRs, our radiology LIS systems roll into me. It's actually quite interesting. At this point in time, we're right smack in the middle of our implementation of Epic at 2 of our campuses, and so far so good. It's going well. So I'm sure someone at work will be wondering, how did he sneak off to do this one? It's a good thing.
We appreciate you joining us today. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Chris Van Wesep at Apptio, and Senior Director of Product Marketing means my team is responsible for how do we tell the Apptio story externally and to our customers. And for those of you that don't know Apptio, we've been around about 15 years. We've got just under 2,000 customers. Typically large organizations, including maybe 60% of the Fortune 100. And we're in the business of helping people make smarter decisions about their IT investments. And that's really fundamentally what our software does. And we do a lot of work with healthcare organizations, but also a lot in financial services, manufacturing, you name it. It's really across the board in terms of verticals.
What's Chris, what's sort of the evolution of the company? What verticals did you start in, and when did you expand into healthcare?
It really wasn't ever verticalized specifically, because at a fundamental level, everybody's got the same problems of trying to deconstruct the black box of IT and figure out, should I spend my next $1 million on more storage capacity, or my transition to cloud, or should I do better customer acquisition, or should I, do more improvements for our end users? And all of those questions are on every CIO's mind. And so coming up with a platform that allows you to bring in relevant data from wherever it may exist to get a kind of a unified view of what your world looks like in terms of IT, and then be able to actually have business conversations with your counterparts in the business units about where the investments are going and what ultimately is going to help the overall organization more. That's everything from Wall Street to to healthcare to insurance companies. They all have the same challenges, and so we really started. It was mostly starting with some very large organizations and make sure we kind of do the complicated stuff and then simplify it a little bit more for smaller organizations.
Very good, Chris. Thank you. All right, Chief, we're going to start with you. Describe your IT governance process. How do you ensure IT spending is being committed in line with the business goals? Is it working well, and where and how can it be improved?
Sure. So, given the fact we're a large health system, thinking about governance is having the right governance is important, and making sure we align with the health system. I'll kind of give a background of our IT organization and then go into the details of that. We're a 2,000-person IT org. If we think about our capital spend, it's somewhere in the region of 45 million, and our OPEX is about 300 million from an IT organization perspective. Now, if you think about how big the health system is, it's a $10 billion health system, but that sounds like a lot of money being put in the hands of IT. So the idea is, how does the institution maximize its spend in IT and make sure that tech folks like myself, don't just go rogue and buy our favorite toys? One of the things we've done is put together 3 levels of governance. One, there's an IT board, which is an external board with members of our overall hospital board and some of our key senior leaders that vet key initiatives and key capital initiatives for the organization. The thing that we're also beginning to find is a lot of the asks that are coming in may not be a traditional IT ask. So for example, we might be deciding to do something like improve our outreach or our access to patients in a specific community. Inherent in that, it doesn't sound IT, but 80% of the vehicle of accomplishing that task is a technology ask. And so we're beginning to see where we have parallels between core business asks and plugging in the right disciplines to make sure that when we're thinking of our budgeting angles, we're adding the IT spend into that. We do have, so like I said, we have the general IT board. If it's a clinical thing, we have our clinical governance groups that go through those types of changes. The IT board goes through the budgeting, and then we submit to finance. If things come up within the year, within the calendar year, we do have a process where we call it OBIT, and I'm blanking on its the acronym, but effectively it's our outside budget investment trust. And that team looks at spend and says, hey, could we pivot our budget to do so? What works well is we barely go rogue on our spend. What doesn't work so well is, given the fact we're big and we're bureaucratic, we're not as nimble as we could be. There's a lot of work we're doing to fix that in terms of creating buckets of cash that sit outside that we can use for net new initiatives. But again, it's still a complicated process to move a big health system. So from that perspective, the governance is right, the auditing is right, the management and alignment seems to be going okay. And then it's just how nimbly we get through the financial processes to get the cash out so that we can actually execute as quickly as possible.
Right. So one of the things you're working on is to try and be in a position to move cash to any emerging need, nimbly. That sounds like one of the principles is we're going to have to, everyone would do the annual budget, but we want to be able to react in real time to things that come up. And that requires putting some money aside. Of course, the issue is you have people begging and clamoring when the budget's done saying, you're telling me we're out of money, but I know you've got money stashed for, what could come up. Well, this is coming up now. Is that kind of a dynamic?
That is the dynamic, yeah. Yeah, I mean, to use it's effectively the Hunger Games for cash. Once you get through your budget cycle, everyone gets into this competition saying, well, this is priority, that priority. But the the outside budget investment trust effectively tries to mitigate that. And we go through a series of things. How much does this spend impact us from a financial point of view, reputational point of view, or quality point of view? And then we rank them that way. But it feels that competitive.
Yeah. John?
Well, I can definitely appreciate the Hunger Games analogy because similar type of scenario. I think for us, where the challenge comes in, our strategic planning process is really a tight process. And when it comes to strategic initiatives, the IT investments are really vetted out as part of that process. So that piece works really well. When you get into what we call the routine investments from a capital perspective, that's where kind of the Hunger Games piece comes in, because there's always more demand. There's going to be cash available for a given year. And so the approach we've been taking is we are having quarterly meetings with each executive and really understanding what they're trying to accomplish and really showing them what's in our pipeline. Not only what they've requested from their organization, but also what's coming from across the organization. That's been really helping them see a holistic picture, which helps the conversation of, hey, we're not going to be able to get to that this year. Maybe that'll be something we can put in, slide in for the next fiscal year cycle. So that's been helpful. And then, everything else goes up to what we call our executive leadership team, which is the CEO's meeting with certain members of the C-suite, where we kind of share, here's what the priority looks like based upon, is it strategic? Is it an operational imperative? Is it mandatory or required? Is this a life cycle component? And so we kind of look at all those different venues, and it gets a rating and score. And then from there, that kind of drives what actually gets funded year over year. But then there's also, to Chief's point, there's that bucket of, okay, if something comes up, how do you handle that? One of the things that we do is we do a quarterly forecast. So even though we have a budget set for the year, we look to see, has anything changed from quarter to quarter that's going to either cause our spending levels to either be less, or do we have to spend a little bit more? And then that way we kind of keep a bit of a contingency in case some things come up that we weren't expecting. And then we kind of handle those accordingly, assuming the funds are there, and we can make those decisions to proceed with those unplanned activities that just come up.
So we do an annual budget every year, and then you're saying there's a quarterly review?
Quarterly review.
Quarterly review, and then Chief had mentioned you even want to be more nimble than that. So it's this balance. Really what we're talking about is a balance between getting ahead of things, being organized, and yet being able to react to changing environment. And you can have any kind of approach to that. There's a million ways to do that, and we're looking for the right one. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing actually, Anthony, is having the fidelity, right? Actually knowing where the money's going, what it's being invested in. And that's just critical. Some of we talked about a quarterly reforecasting process. Some of our best customers do it monthly. If you get a system in place that actually allows you to do it without a lot of overhead, then you can start really being reactive to the business needs and making sure that you're really maximizing the working capital that you got in place. And it takes a bit of time and process to get there, but man, being able to move things as needed when needs change is pretty powerful.
Chris, how does what you provide jive or work with governance processes? So I would imagine they work together. It sort of what you're providing, the software you're providing, integrates with the governance process to make that a more efficient process.
Yeah, well, and Chif and John could probably illuminate even more on how they do it, with our stuff in their organizations. But the idea is at the top line, make sure you're understanding the strategic priorities of the organization and how each of the investments that you're making actually align to that, and actually be able to get a view, sometimes for the first time, of here's the exact breakdown of the amount of spend we're applying, both from an operational perspective and a growth initiatives that accrue to what the strategic priorities are for the organization. A lot of folks don't even have that level of fidelity. And then being able to assess, like we were saying, even on a monthly basis, how is the actual spend, taking place relative to what you had planned, and where are we going with it, and what's the business impact, and if we need to make a change, let's make a change, and being able to have that kind of flexibility.
Chif, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're doing with our IT forecasting is exactly that. We look at the entire spend. We break them into, we break them into the initiatives, and we tie the initiatives back to the alignment. But one of the things, like John highlighted, that actually gets tricky and often is the sacrificial lamb is routine. The things we do for maintenance, they might be oftentimes in the OpEx, but when you think about new storage systems or new server infrastructures, or perhaps transitioning to a cloud-based system, you're always in that fight between this is capital, this is operating, and it does not necessarily fit into the traditional narrative of this is what it takes to run a healthcare system, right? So having the most resilient data center or the best data center, yeah, that's great, but we want to take care of patients, we want to put buildings, we want to buy equipment that can help us treat patients, etc. So having that visibility into our spend in our routine capital, and then beginning to think about how we transition some of that routine cap into an OpEx is something that is top of mind for us, just so that we can reduce our capital ask. But again, in some ways, it's shifting the bill from one bucket to the other. But we're looking at ways to do that and get the things that we need to do so that we can provide the value that the enterprise is looking for, the platforms that give us the backbone to provide that platform, that technology or that solution that they're looking for, making sure that we have reserved the capital to keep that up and operational is key for us as well.
So, Chif, even though you're just, as you mentioned, even though you're just moving it from one bucket to another, that still is a benefit to you?
It is. It is. I think depending on the organization, in some organizations, capital is a lot harder to come by than operating. Some folks they're operating in a sense that you get your next year's budget is based on your last year's spend. So you don't have to do some funky math or have to justify it as this is what we spend to get to where we are. So from that accounting point of view, or that removing or reducing the complexity of our Hunger Game, that is a strategy to do so. And also, frankly, it's easier for us to have cash at hand, especially given the current climate. So moving more things, more traditional routine expenses into OpEx also helps our organization reduce our capital needs and also allows big cash at hand to be available for the larger enterprise.
John, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I agree with Chif. I think the thing is, at least for our organization, it was really education around the shift in what's happening in the market, and that you're going to have a shift in things moving to OpEx that traditionally were capital. And so that education piece is, for me, that's really the most important element of it, because our organization likes predictability, and which I can appreciate, and the moving to cloud-based solutions, SaaS-based solutions, things that are now OpEx, that gives that level of predictability. So that was something that was beneficial in that education. And I think the key thing, and I think it doesn't matter whether it's capital or OpEx related spend, the thing that's always critical to convey is the supportability of those solutions. While the model may be a bit different with SaaS and cloud, there's still going to be some level of support that you're going to have to grow over time, and not to give the sense that because I'm shifting to OpEx, I no longer need support of those solutions, is one of the messages that I always make sure we deliver, because at some point you're going to have to grow your team, and you want to set that foundation early in the process when you're moving to OpEx based spend versus CapEx.
Chris, anything you want to add there?
I think they covered it on that one.
Okay, very good. All right, next question. John, we're going to start with you. How can IT describe technology investment choices in language business leaders will understand? John, are you often presenting choices to business leaders about we could do A or B in terms of technology spend, and you want to make sure you're conveying that in the right terms that they understand?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to, I'll start with kind of the routine pieces, because I think that's the piece that, requires that education understanding. So if I'm having to replace all of my devices, or I'm having to refresh my network, the question that normally comes up is, well, our network is up and running. Why do you need to replace it? It's still working. And so I like to use the analogy of remodeling a home that is a 30-year-old home, and you've had the same HVAC that entire time. Now, going into summertime, your AC may be working fine, but typically after year 20, they start to fail. And do you want to be in a position of high heat with your AC going out, and then you're without AC for 1 week or so while you're trying to get that repaired? So I like to give those types of analogies, whether it's foundation. You don't build a home and you don't frame the home before you put in a foundation. And so the underlying infrastructure from a technology perspective is the foundation. And so we can't build on top of a foundation that's not there. And so I like to give those types of analogies as part of that discussion. And even in a scenario when you're talking to the business around some of the solutions that they're interested in, everything now is the discussions around digital. And so where do you start? And so you sometimes you have to provide a menu of options. Are we going to start with outpatient? Or are you going to focus on pre-visit activities versus point of service versus post-visit? And you want to be able to give them options of, here's the biggest pain point based on what we're seeing, whether it's patient satisfaction related to that initial experience, and be able to say, if we invest $500,000 on the pre-visit activities, that's going to increase your patient satisfaction X%. Where the pain point with post-visit, your patient satisfaction scores are already in the 90th percentile. Do you really want to focus the investment there, or you want to focus it on the pre-visit where patient sat is in 75th percentile? And so that try to make it easier for them to get to the right decision with those types of analogies and descriptions.
Excellent. Chif?
Yeah, I think I agree with John. I think it's tying it back to what we want to accomplish as an enterprise and what we are afraid to lose, right? So I'll give you, years ago, I'm sure many CISOs struggled to get funding for security. Why? It's like paying for insurance. Most of us, when we go buy something, they ask you to pay for insurance. You're like, yeah, I'm never going to need that. And you don't pay for it, right? And then that device or tool or service you procure, the moment that risk becomes actualized, you wish you had the insurance. So the mindset typically is that's an expense that I can't deal with. Now, due to a lot of bad actors, there's, CISOs are not struggling to sell their story these days, but that is a strategy with which we explain things. What's the risk? If we don't patch, for example, our infrastructure, if we don't modernize our devices, we have these vulnerabilities. If you can quantify those vulnerabilities in terms of cost, for example, if a ransomware attack were to succeed, we present that risk and that cost associated with that. Not all investments have to be sold with fear. We could also sell them from the perspective of capacity, right? So there's a lot of things we want to do. If you really want to get the greatest telehealth experience, well, we're going to have to invest in the right devices and infrastructure to support that experience. So it's kind of selling and this is on the routine end, it's kind of selling what the technology allows them to do and how it ties back to an initiative they want. And in instances of most of our infrastructure backend stuff that most C-suite frankly don't care about, is realizing the risk. If we don't have the right patch system, if we don't have the right infrastructure, this is a certain risk, and being transparent of what the cost of each risk is.
Chief, do you ever get pushback that is almost in a sense of, well, I don't want it to be so expensive. I want you to give me the level of
Options.
service I want, but I want you to get it for less than you're telling me it costs. You figure it out because it
Yeah, of
costs too
course.
much.
Yeah, and I honestly, frankly, we wouldn't have jobs if we just paid for everything, right? So one of the things our role is to define the options. My job is to present options to the team, to the board, and say we could do option A, B, and C. Here's the cost benefit for each option. This is a strong recommendation. And depending on where we are from a financial situation, we'll leave it up to the governance group to opine on which pathway we go. The approach that we typically take is not necessarily go in with a this is it or this is a one solution. We come with about 2 or 3 options and we give the pros and the cons. Each one has a certain dollar value attached to it based on risk and benefit, and let the governance folks be as informed as they need to be so that they can make a decision. We might be leaning for an expensive solution because we think it's the best comprehensive thing to do, but sometimes we don't want to make perfect the enemy of good. So sometimes we'll take good, and if that's the risk that our leadership is willing to bear, or the cost they're willing to put on it, or the premium, then that's fair.
John, you're providing your organization with numbers, right? When you talk about options, you're giving there's a cost associated with it. You have to have the trust of your C-suite peers and your board that you're getting the best numbers, the right numbers. Is that an important part of the job, that the numbers you're providing them are the best numbers?
Oh, absolutely. When you have to present these options, you want to give them the best possible information. And one of the things that I like to talk about is, there's I'll call it the retail cost of technology. So equipment, software, or whatever that component may be, their services. I like to break it down for them into those buckets. This is the cost of the actual technology. Here's the cost of the services to implement those solutions. And one of the things that I think is important to be able to convey is, what kind of negotiations are you taking into those agreements? So they understand that you are really getting the best possible pricing based upon not just that particular deal, but your entire spend with that particular vendor, particularly if you're talking about your core infrastructure. You're going to have a few vendors that provide a lot of those capabilities for you. And you want to be able to convey and share what they're bringing to the table, how you're able to get the best pricing. And even to Chief's point, there's some options. Everything isn't a Rolls Royce pricing model. And so being able to share with them, here's a couple of different pricing options. Here's what it's going to provide us. Here's what we won't get if we go with the middle of the road investment. And being able to describe that in terms of risk, as Chief talked about, is critical to that discussion, because you have to give them context to the pricing and the budget and investment information that you're giving, along with what are we going to get out of this investment? What's going to allow us to do? And is it going to allow us to continue to advance our strategic priorities? Or is this going to focus more on running the day-to-day operations of the system? I think those things in context are critical for whether you're presenting to the board or whether you're presenting to your investment board.
Chris, thoughts?
As I've listened to these two guys, it's so many great things in here. But what really keeps popping up is that they've got a really good connection with the business, and that's just critical. And the only way you get that, you earn your seat at the table for those things, right? You need to build the trust, and that comes from having your ducks in a row and being able to, like Chief was saying, expose that here are the multiple options, and I'm going to share with you what the cost drivers actually are behind the business, and what our alternatives look like, and what the implications of those alternatives would be. And we found over the years that when you can expose those levers to people in a way that's that's transparent and justifiable, that you can actually back up what the numbers are saying, the trust really builds, and that's when you can actually start having some better conversations. And then how does it line up to patient experience, clinician experience, the quality we deliver, the value that's being delivered? Let's prioritize these things based on the outcomes we're trying to get and make the right decisions.
Very good. All right. Let's go to our next question. John, we're going to go with you. Can you offer any anecdotes that illustrate IT partnering with the business to achieve business goals in a more cost efficient and effective way?
Sure. So, I'll give you a couple examples. When I first joined CHOC just over 4 years ago, one of the big things that the organization was interested in is modernizing our ERP. So we did a full-blown assessment, brought in a third party to help us with that. I had to partner with our chief HR officer and our VP of finance, who had responsibility for payroll. We had a shorter period of time to get to what direction we want to go in. And so that third party really helped us kind of craft, what are we trying to accomplish? What does HR operations need? What does payroll need? And we got to a solution. We made a selection. At that point in time, I had built, I felt like a good level of trust with my two peers. They basically said, hey, you go off, you negotiate the agreement, you tell us the best approach to take with this implementation. And so they allowed me to do that, kept them in the loop. We got the deal done. But what happened was we really had about 6 months to implement. The way our capital process works, we don't get to carry over capital year over year. You have to use it within the year it's funded. So we had to come up with a plan to implement HR payroll on Workday in really 6 months. And we actually did it in 5.5. And the only way we were able to do that is my partnership with the chief HR officer and VP of finance. We had to come to agreement on we were going to implement pure delivered functionality. And the only way we would customize if there was a compelling business case that they signed off on that we just had to have. We didn't have a scenario like that, and allowed us to implement that in 5.5 months and really get the value. I always say it was like we went from a flip phone to an iPhone to modernize our ERP. That's just one example where we had a great partnership and we got the outcome that we were looking for.
Very good, Chief. Any anecdotes you want to offer about IT partnering with business leaders in the business to achieve goals?
Well, it's no partnership, no success, right? The way we are right now, our role for the most part is to drive outcomes for business units. So it's inherent in everything that we do. One of the things, a very good example is right now we're implementing an electronic health record. And it doesn't matter what technology folks want. If we don't have clinical buy-in, regulatory buy-in, legal buy-in, finance buy-in, revenue cycle buy-in, we will not be able to achieve the outcomes we're looking for or get the value that we want out of that investment. So even from the budgeting through the execution and through the value realization aspect of it, it is very, very key to have strong relationships with the business partners to get you there. Because one more thing I'll add is, frankly, they ultimately define success, right? So you kind of have to be in step with them.
Very good. All right, next question. John, let's go with you. When there is a need, how can IT most effectively articulate a request for an increase in budgetary dollars? How often are new projects funded by reallocated current budget versus asking for incremental budget?
Sure. So when you're trying to grow your FT count, that requires a level of I'll say diplomacy. At least it's been my experience. And so what I like to do is take it from a couple of different layers. So if this is more of a run the business growth, because let's say, for instance, part of our strategy is to add more primary cares into our network, and so more M&A activity. So if we've added 6 new primary cares in 2 years, and we converted those to our EMR and integrated them into our core infrastructure. That also means that our volume and the number of things that we're having to support, number of people, devices we're having to support has grown by X factor. So I like to bring that sort of information to the table to say, I'm just really trying to right size and keep the same service levels that the organization has been accustomed to. If we don't grow these resources to continue to provide the support, then you will start to see some degradation in service levels. If you're okay with the service levels dropping, then we can maintain. But if you want us to keep these and or exceed, then we're going to have to grow the team. That's one part of the discussion. Then there's the other part where as you're growing and adding new technologies, new software solutions into your portfolio, and it's not always a one-to-one scenario where I'm adding software and solutions and I'm taking away software and solutions. So you want to be able to paint that picture. Hey, we're actually not sunsetting applications. These are new lines that we are going into, which require new software solutions. So I've added 5 new solutions into the portfolio that's related to patient engagement, patient experience, and the team that is doing that, they're not able to sustain the level of enhancements that are coming. So if we want to continue to grow and enable these services, then that's going to require some growth in FTEs. So I like to give that level of context and what we won't be able to do if we stay the status quo.
And that works pretty well, John?
For the most part, that works well. It works, I will tell you, it does work better with new technology acquisition than it does with running the day-to-day business.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's always a scenario where, well, how can we, can you work? Can you automate more things so you don't need as many people? And so that's a constant dilemma because we're always trying to automate and eliminate manual effort. But the key thing is, in order to eliminate the manual effort, you actually have to have the skill set to do all of the automation. And then once you get the automation, then you can, then your resources are able to kind of stretch a little further. Mm-hmm. And so it's a kind of the catch-22.
Chif?
Yeah, I look at adding budget as a capacity thing, whether it's capacity from, like John highlighted, from what the team can be able to support, and more importantly, from what's the value to the group should we add said capacity. So I think the big thing is to know the audience and know the business line that is funding that initiative. Like John said, if it's a net new capital initiative, oftentimes there's an external source and there's funding available. And if you get in the right ears sooner rather than later, because everybody wants this net new initiative to be successful, oftentimes the dollars are there for it and you can make it successful. So I think being in the ears early about what we can offer, being transparent about the costs we can eliminate or the opportunities to eliminate costs by implementing X or by investing in X number of new resources coming in is key. I'll give you a case in point. In one of our service lines, our biomedical engineering service lines, these are very, very expensive pieces of equipment. You typically want the best of the vendor support, it makes sense. If you're a world-class institution, you want gold star support for $1 million pieces of equipment. Over years, we did an analysis and then we found we had folks that could actually do this work if we upskilled them. So so it became a big ask about how do we upskill our talent to be able to do this and then get an at-risk cost from the big players in that field. It took a lot of selling, a lot of math, and being friends with our operational excellence and our finance folks. But once we got the numbers in, we actually did find that by even adding more staff to us and insourcing a lot of that skill sets, we're able to offset a lot of very, very expensive investments that we're making with support contracts. Mm-hmm. So it's striking that balance and having those relationships and knowing, more importantly, it's all about the timing. When is the right time to make an ask, and see how it goes.
Chris, anything you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think these guys are highlighting it, but the first and primary thing is you're not going to be able to make your business case without having the right data. And so making sure that you've got the numbers at hand to say, here's what the implications are of what we're asking for, or what will happen if we don't get this kind of funding is always good. And the other thing, we didn't touch on it as much, the second part of this question, there tend to be inefficiencies in almost everything that people are doing, and being able to find funding on your own and then evangelize the fact that you are self-funding, by transforming operational spend into growth initiatives is always, a welcome thing, across the C-suite.
All right, very good. Let's go to our next question. Chief, let's start with you. How can IT demonstrate the business value provided from previous investments? So how do you show them that they got something for their money?
So one of the things that has become a big culture change in our organization is defining the baseline, right? So, if anyone who's taken any of the various project management doctrines, the first thing is you implement a project with the expectation that there's some value at the end, there's a benefit to the organization at the end. Sounds easy, sounds benign. The question is, how do I measure the benefit? 9 out of 10 times we jump into projects without a clear indication of what our baselines are. And we don't ask ourselves the fundamental question, what needle are we trying to move? So one of the things that we've learned, we've gotten burnt, we've put in $1 million pieces of software, and no one can truly articulate what value it brought. We replaced widget A with widget B, spent a lot of money for it, and frankly, we're still doing the same things we did with widget A. So one of the things I will say first is figure out what we're measuring and figure out what metric matters to the constituents at the point in time, right? So if you're an inpatient facility and you're thinking about bringing in some tools and some process changes that would improve length of stay. All right, if length of stay is the metric, let's figure out what is our average length of stay. Once we've put in that investment and that implementation, let's go back and check and measure what it was at baseline and what it is now. Once we have that, that's how we gain our trust, right? So we gain the trust to get the next project, the next ask, and tying back all our spends back to those initiatives and those metrics that matter to the business. It's easy for us to say, listen, let's use an infrastructure one, 100% or 99.99% uptime. Okay, that probably doesn't mean much to 99% of our clinicians or our business users, right? A good way to measure it is how many minutes were spent, the doctor spent on documenting, or how many hours of ED time was saved. And all of a sudden, being able to draw those correlations with the data, it tells a much more cogent story.
John?
Yeah, I agree with Chief. It's one of the areas where we are really trying to improve our overarching processes, that baseline. We haven't done, I would say, a consistent job with outlining what those baseline measures are for these initiatives that we're taking on and what's our target goals. We're doing a much better job on the strategic side, but that's really the key thing. What are we trying to improve upon? What's the baseline? And really building that whole process into the deployment so that when you do deploy, you're not chasing a baseline or chasing how you're performing. You've built that into what you're delivering. And so now you just have the information, insights of monitoring those targets versus what you're actually realizing at your fingertips. That's really the key thing. I think one of the other scenarios is kind of Chief was outlining is when it's not a strategic initiative, you still want to identify what's going to determine success, what's going to be the value for this investment. And so one of the things that we're doing now is that's really a requirement. We don't green light your project to move out of the planning phase unless we define what your baseline is going to be, so that we can track that and move that in. So, for instance, one thing we're doing with supply chain and periodic services is preference card standardization. So leveraging our analytics infrastructure to really understand what type of variation do we have on our preference cards. And then that drives a high cost variation for the same procedures. And so we've been able to really highlight that through information and data insights. So now the surgeons are looking at that and they're saying, okay, well, let's figure out. The first thing they said to us was, well, unblind the information. We want to see who the physicians are, who the surgeons are that have all this high cost. We didn't want to do that initially, but we were able to, they jumped right to it and they were engaged from that point on. And so now we're moving into second and third service lines, trying to help them drive out cost, but also keep the same quality of care. They were really invested in understanding how they were performing. And so you had a baseline that they could react to and say, we want to be better than that baseline.
Chris, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, it's all about KPIs and metrics. That's something that we focus on with all of our customers as the deployments get rolling, is saying, let's get the baselines established and then let's figure out what we're going to be tracking as we go forward. It's critical to be able to show that value over time.
All right, we're going to go to our Ask a Co-Panelist segment here. And Chris, I'm going to give you the first opportunity to ask one or both of your co-panelists a question. Sure.
The discipline that we're fundamentally talking about here is technology business management. And as folks get started on this path of having a focused effort towards TBM, I'd be interested from both John and Chif, what did you guys find as the biggest obstacle to getting that process started that you needed to overcome?
John, you want to go first?
Sure. I think the biggest obstacle, I would say, really is explaining why would I use this? What's going to be different with this versus our traditional budget variance reporting that we already provide? And so explaining that in the terms of, hey, I want to be able to understand the different layers of services we're providing, and then be able to share with you, the business, here's what my investments are for business technologies, here's what my investments are for clinical technologies, and here's how I'm really managing those different layers and different domains and what levers I can pull. Once we got through that piece, then I'll say the technical work to manage this sort of thing is just the work. And so that education piece and articulating the value was, I'll say, the biggest hurdle.
So it's moving from being a cost center to being a strategic partner to them.
Right.
Yeah. Chif?
I think it's all about trust. Being able to build trust based on past successes or new behaviors. I think a key component of being able to build that trust is the transparency. So when we come together to put together governance groups that could help guide that with constituents from different key areas of the business, having the right people in those boards that represent a sufficient spectrum of the business is key. And then being able to share that by using these types of tools, by being able to have insight into our expenses, and that we're not hiding anything, we're transparent about where the IT dollars are going, is a big value add. And as we begin to build those trusts in terms of transparency in our routine spend, I often say innovation starts at operations. Once we've gotten that and our operations are good and people could see our operations, people build that trust, we earn the right to innovate. We earn the right to be at the table to do more things. But it's easier said than done, but it's a journey that we're on.
Chif, did you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
Sure. Chris, you've heard us talk about our budgeting and our governance structures. What would you say have been the prevalent styles that you're seeing across different disciplines that are using your tool?
Can you clarify a little bit more in terms of the
Like how are folks doing their governance? How are they using your tool to support governance? And what are the different governance structures you're seeing?
You know, there's a huge maturity model, and people are finding value at all layers. You know, if what your problem statement is coming out of the gate, which it is for some people, is my CFO came to me and had a simple request of how much are we spending in terms of labor, you know, on X, Y, or Z. I don't know the answer to that because I don't, this is what they're saying back to the CFO. I'll have to go look for that information and pull the right people and pull the data. You know, the ability to quickly respond to the ad hoc questions that come in about the business, or to be able, like you guys are saying, to simply have a coherent variance analysis that you're able to conduct on a regular basis to say, we intended to spend this, we've spent this, let's understand the deltas and be able to make smart decisions about it. That's, I consider, kind of a baseline view of things, but very important. As you start kind of going up the stack, you know, when you get into a world where people are getting their arms around, here's the entire, in fact, a good customer of ours in the healthcare space, north central Great Lakes kind of area. Every time they acquire a new hospital or clinic, they are presented with a portfolio of applications that organization was using that's going to be disparate from what the standard is, but by having mapped all of the things that actually drive the business in terms of application services, et cetera, they're able to do really quickly a comparison between these and identify the things that they can port over, see if there's any good learnings from the new place that they can start mapping into the rest of the organization, but quickly get those values of scale that they had talked about when they went through the acquisition process. And so it can be at that level. And even higher up, there's a lot of folks that are going into the showback and chargeback models more efficiently now, and saying, I am going to completely expose to you what your cost levers are that are driving your part of the business, and empower you to work with us to make smarter decisions, and the ability to drive down costs and get better decisions made in partnership with the business is a function of being able to have that level of exposure. So there is a real spectrum, and I think as people continue along the journey, they can keep doing more and more with it.
Very good. All right, John, did you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
Sure. Yeah, I think my question is really more around trends in investment spending. Are you guys seeing a real shift to more AI, machine learning type capabilities, more digital, and less away from some of the traditional spend? I know, Chris, you probably see this, you know, more broadly across all your client base, but just interested in kind of what you guys are seeing there.
Chris?
I think it's slower than people think it might be, and it always depends on the industry. There's obviously, you go to Silicon Valley, and you know, born in the cloud organizations there are doing things much more rapidly. But everybody is dabbling in it, and so the amount of spend is small, but everybody's got something that they're working on and trying to see if they can make a go of it. It's kind of similar to cloud spend. You know, that's been a thing for over a decade now, and it's still, you know, not the predominant, you know, way that IT is spending its resources today. It continues to grow, and it's really important, but there's still a lot of spend that's done in the on-premises side of the world. So people are dabbling in it, but it's not necessarily the rocket ship that everybody thinks it is, I think.
Chif, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Chris. You know, initially it came up, and a whole bunch of us said that we got to do it, we've got to do it. And then we got a couple of tools or free tools, and then we started looking for problems to solve. And every other thing, the problems are not as easy to solve as they are. So we're not spending nearly as much. I think oftentimes too, we forget that bad machine learning and AI doesn't fix bad process. So we, you know, so part of the thing is realizing that there's a chicken and an egg. Is how do you work on your process improvements and then layer on the technology to automate that, your enhanced process. So that's kind of where we are, but we've been distracted with our big implementation, and we may go back to it. But like he said, I think we're dabbling.
I always say automating bad processes just breaks things faster than they were breaking before.
We're about out of time. Chris, you want to give us a quick last word, final advice for our listeners today?
Thank you. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this. And I would say for folks that are thinking about kind of getting started on this TBM journey with whatever tool set you end up doing it with, get started. It is putting one foot in front of the other, even if you don't think you've got the best data or the right processes or anything like that. Start the process, and the improvements will come as a result of that.
Perfect. Well, that's about all we had time for today regarding continuing education. You could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for upcoming webinars. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel, John Henderson, Chif Umejei, and Chris Van Wesep. And I want to thank our sponsor Apptio for making this possible. And I want to thank you, our attendees. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.